There are moments within the silent corridors of the royal palace that do not make noise until the weight of history forces them open. For decades, the public believed that the transition of power from Queen Elizabeth II to King Charles III was a seamless story of continuity, traditional duty, and quiet acceptance. However, behind closed doors, a far more intricate and calculated plan was already set in motion long before the world said goodbye to the longest reigning monarch in modern history. Prince William recently brought into the light a document that everyone in the inner circle knew existed, yet nobody dared to touch. This was not a casual draft or an informal piece of family advice. It was a precise, legally binding, and deeply deliberate instruction left behind by Queen Elizabeth II herself, specifically regarding the royal title, the ceremonial reach, and the definitive boundaries of Camilla's position as queen. When Prince William walked into the room carrying the dark folder containing these pages, the atmosphere instantly shifted. This was not a routine family gathering or a polite afternoon conversation over tea. It was a moment where duty severed through decades of delicate family negotiations. Placing the folder firmly on the table, William looked directly at his father, King Charles, and his stepmother, Camilla. Inside those pages lay an instruction that drew a permanent line directly through the future of Camilla's royal authority. The document explicitly declared that while Camilla would hold her title during the reign of King Charles, her position was to remain strictly ceremonial and intrinsically tied to Charles's time on the throne. Crucially, it stated that her title must never be used to exert independent authority or influence over the future monarchy, specifically safeguarding the future position and sovereign dignity of Catherine, the Princess of Wales. The genius and severity of Queen Elizabeth's decision lay in her incredible foresight. She did not leave this issue to chance, nor did she allow it to be buried in dusty royal archives where palace aides might quietly alter its meaning over time. She understood the complex emotional calculus of her family. She knew that Charles, driven by decades of intense personal loyalty and devotion to Camilla, would naturally seek to expand her influence and elevate her standing as much as possible. But Queen Elizabeth was a monarch first and a mother second. She recognized that allowing the boundaries around Camilla's title to blur could create a dangerous precedent, opening the door to competing claims of influence when the crown eventually passed to William and Catherine. To prevent a constitutional crisis long after her passing, the late Queen personally documented, sealed, and assigned her grandson, Prince William, as the ultimate custodian of this final command. The emotional impact in the room when the document was revealed was overwhelming. King Charles lowered his eyes in silent heartbreak. He did not argue, nor did he attempt to interrupt his son. For years, Charles had fought a relentless battle against public scrutiny, tabloid hostility, and the enduring shadow of Princess Diana to bring Camilla to a place of public acceptance. He had secured her the title of Queen Consort, believing the battle for her status was finally won. Yet, sitting in that room, he was forced to confront the painful truth that his mother's final judgment placed strict and immovable limits on that acceptance. Camilla sat frozen as the reality of the words settled around her. She was not being stripped of her dignity or erased from public life, but her authority was being contained. The late queen had constructed an invisible yet unbreakable wall between Camilla's present role and the future reign of William and Catherine. Closing the folder slowly, William made it clear that this final instruction was not delivered out of personal malice or resentment. He was not acting merely as a son confronting his father. He was acting as the heir to the throne, fulfilling a sacred obligation to protect the continuity of the monarchy. The late queen had recognized long before anyone else that the transition between reigns must remain absolute and undisturbed by emotional politics. By placing this responsibility on William's shoulders, Queen Elizabeth ensured that when the time comes for Catherine to step forward as queen, her authority will be unblemished and entirely free from competing claims. This was the opening move in a historic reckoning that would reshape the inner dynamics of Buckingham Palace forever. Every deep structural conflict within a monarchy has a specific moment in time that appears small when it happens, but later turns out to be the exact point where history altered its path. To fully understand why Queen Elizabeth II felt compelled to leave such a definitive final instruction, one must look back at a hidden moment that unfolded during a private title consultation at Windsor Castle. At the time, what began as a routine administrative discussion regarding ceremonial ranks, and wording rapidly transformed into a serious warning sign for the late monarch. In royal protocol, whoever controls the precise wording of official titles controls public perception and long-term authority. During this particular consultation, advisors aligned with Camilla's household press for language that would subtly shift her official standing closer to shared sovereign authority, a realm of influence traditionally reserved exclusively for the reigning monarch alone. The Queen listened quietly, observing every subtle shift in tone without interrupting. Present in that room were Prince William, King Charles, who was Prince of Wales at the time, and a senior courtier watching the delicate balance of power. Charles, wanting desperately to protect Camilla and smooth her path into the royal family, attempted to soften the tension by advocating for flexible terminology. However, when the phrase shared royal authority was introduced into discussion, the room turned icy cold. The late Queen slowly set down her pen without finishing the note she was writing. That single, understated gesture brought the entire meeting to a sudden halt. Prince William caught the change immediately. Queen Elizabeth was not expressing loud anger. Her reaction was far more dangerous because it was grounded in calm, analytical foresight. She realized that if Camilla's title were allowed to stretch beyond ceremonial respect and into governing authority, the future line of the crown would eventually become clouded by emotional loyalty and competing claims of power. Directly following that consultation, Queen Elizabeth took immediate action to protect the future of the crown. Away from advisors and personal influences, she privately dictated the exact text that would eventually form the core of the seal folder William presented years later. Her directive explicitly defined Camilla's future role. She was to be honored, respected, and given full public dignity, but her reach was strictly limited. Her title could never be used to establish precedents that might shadow or dictate how the next monarch would govern. What made this document so deeply personal yet constitutionally heavy was that it was born not out of dislike for Camilla, but out of absolute duty to the institution. The Queen foresaw that during the sensitive transition between reigns, the lines between personal affection and sovereign power could easily blur unless an unyielding boundary was established in writing. When William eventually read these exact lines aloud to Charles and Camilla in that intense private meeting, years of buried emotions immediately resurfaced. There were no press secretaries present to soften the words, and no palace buffers to translate duty into gentler language. William stood firm, insisting that Camilla hear the late Queen's instructions directly, without any filtering. Camilla, maintaining her composure under immense pressure, asked William directly if he believed she had deliberately overstepped her boundaries over the years. The prince answered with measured care, explaining that the document was never meant to publicly humiliate her, but to establish necessary boundaries that could not be crossed under any circumstances. Charles intervened, questioning why his mother's instruction had to be brought forward at this specific moment, after Camilla had already endured decades of public backlash, and after his own reign had finally found stability. Yet William stood his ground as the future king. He reminded his father that the survival of the crown relied on personal devotion, bowing to structural rules. He then read the most decisive line from the folder. Camilla's title must never be used to influence the position of the future queen. The mention of the future queen was a direct reference to Catherine, ensuring that her standing, her authority, and her future transition alongside William will remain entirely untouchable. Charles reached across the table to take the document, but William hesitated briefly before releasing it. That brief pause spoke volumes. It signaled that control of the crown's future trajectory now rested in the hands of the next generation. The hidden consultation from years ago had finally yielded its ultimate outcome, setting off a chain reaction of practical administrative changes throughout the palace. Once the private confrontation ended and the document was returned to a protective casing, the immediate reality of Queen Elizabeth's final instruction began to ripple through the operational machinery of Buckingham Palace. The royal institution can absorb private family arguments, but cannot ignore explicit constitutional boundaries once they are brought to light. Almost overnight, subtle yet profound adjustments began taking place behind the scenes. Revised schedules were distributed. Official initialing protocols were altered, and access to key forward-planning briefings regarding the future line of succession was quietly restricted. For Camilla, these practical changes brought a quiet, dignified humiliation. There were no public announcements, loud disputes, or tabloid headlines detailing every administrative shift. Instead, it arrived through doors that no longer opened as easily as they once had, briefings to which she was no longer invited, and ceremonial drafts that were meticulously edited to remove any language implying authority beyond Charles's reign. Staff members throughout the royal households picked up on the shift long before the outside world began to piece the narrative together. When Camilla arrived for a scheduled briefing, expecting standard discussions regarding upcoming royal tours and ceremonial representations, she found the gathering significantly restructured. Senior advisors had narrowed the agenda, and her primary representative was absent from the room. A staff member carefully informed her that matters regarding future royal precedents and succession imagery would henceforth be handled separately under the direct oversight of Prince William's office. William's team maintained that these procedural updates represented necessary clarification rather than punishment, enforcing the structural boundaries left behind by the late Queen. However, inside the palace, everyone recognized the true weight of what was occurring. Ceremonial protocols, the exact rules governing how royal ranks appear at state occasions, were being firmly recalibrated to protect Catherine's future standing. King Charles felt the painful bite of these administrative changes deeply. In a moment of rare frustration, he sharply closed an official document folder in front of senior aides, the sound echoing through the room as a clear warning. He understood that his personal devotion to his wife was crashing directly into the unyielding machinery of the crown he had inherited. While Charles possessed the ultimate authority of a reigning monarch on paper, he could not openly defy his mother's written command without undermining the very legitimacy and continuity of the monarchy itself. Meanwhile, Camilla observed the physical proof of her contained authority in subsequent ceremonial programs. Her title remained prominent, dignified, and treated with utmost public respect, yet the surrounding descriptions had been carefully stripped of any phrasing that suggested long-term influence over the future shape of the royal institution. She realized the sharp paradox of her position. Honored to stand beside the king today, but firmly reminded that tomorrow belonged to William and Catherine. Recognizing that the growing coldness threatened to permanently fracture the family, Prince William sought a private, one-on-one conversation with his father, away from advisors, secretaries, and palace politics. Sitting together in a quiet room at Windsor, beneath a framed photograph of Queen Elizabeth II, father and son faced the emotional devastation left in the wake of the revealed instruction. Charles confessed with profound vulnerability that he felt forced to choose between loyalty to his wife and obedience to his late mother. William listened with measured empathy, assuring his father that his actions were not driven by personal resentment or desire for control, but by the solemn duty to safeguard the crown's future integrity. After an intense and emotional discussion, Charles finally surrendered to the reality of his mother's vision. He accepted that while he could surround Camilla with love and devotion, the constitutional boundaries guarding Catherine's future place as queen were absolute and unalterable. By the following morning, the story could no longer be contained within palace walls. Front-page headlines across major national newspapers published reports highlighting the historic clarification surrounding Camilla's role and the late Queen's final protective line drawn for the future monarchy. Crowds gathered outside the palace gates sensed a profound historical shift, recognizing that Queen Elizabeth's wisdom continued to govern the realm even after her passing. Ultimately, this revelation did not destroy the royal family. It provided ultimate clarity. It established a clear, permanent boundary between personal affection and sovereign power. William proved his readiness to protect the continuity of the crown. Charles bore the heavy emotional cost of supreme duty, and Catherine's future place beside the throne was rendered permanently secure under the enduring shadow of Queen Elizabeth's final command.